we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States. Brother Clegg, Sister Butler, thank you so much for that beautiful musical number. There are words that can only be voiced through music. Jeff, thank you for your beautiful prayer. Brothers and sisters, the gospel of Jesus Christ contains the recipe for human happiness, freedom, and flourishing. As individuals, as marriages, families, communities, societies, and polities or countries. Can anyone tell me what the word gospel means? It comes from the Greek. Can anyone know? Yes, Jeff.
Good news.
The good news, that's right. Gospel means the good news. Through Jesus Christ, his atoning work, his death, and his resurrection, we can be forgiven of our sins and be saved. Tonight, I come to share good news. While the gospel of Jesus Christ literally means good news, it does not mean easy news. It does not mean convenient news. It does not mean comfortable news. It does not mean popular news. Anyone who has been human knows that life is not easy. It's a wrestle. In fact, Israel means those who wrestle or struggle with God and let God prevail. My first message to you tonight is that the recipe for human happiness, freedom, and flourishing is good news. Not easy, but worth it. It is a recipe. It is almost mechanical or empirical in nature. It's not magical or mystical. If you follow the recipe, happiness, prosperity, flourishing will follow as promised in D&C 132, 20-21. It's that kind of a recipe. In our church meetings, we typically focus on the good news as it's applied close to home, our individual discipleship, our families, and our communities. Now, all truth can be circumscribed into one great whole. All truth belongs to God. Personal, spiritual, emotional, financial, political, biological, societal. Through Christ's own teachings, the teachings of his prophets, and the inspiration he has given to men and women through the ages, we can learn the path that we collectively walk to achieve human happiness, freedom, and flourishing. That doesn't mean we won't experience individual tragedy, sorrow, setbacks, or calamity. It does mean that we can experience peace and comfort, even happiness, joy, and fulfillment in spite of those things. And we can persevere, persist, endure, and build our families and communities and make life better for those who follow. And that's part of what makes it worth it. Now, tonight we're not discussing politics per se, but political and societal principles and structures. In this space, just as within our personal space, there are rules or principles to follow and learn. Effort is required, significant effort, but we already know that, don't we? We also know that life is about choosing your hard. There's no avoiding the hard. We stand on the shoulders of giants, men and women who over centuries, even millennia, have chosen the hard and built a far better world for us than they themselves inherited and enjoyed. My first message to you tonight is the recipe for human happiness, freedom, and flourishing is good news. Not easy, but worth it. My second message is that our job is to do the same as those who came before us. Choose the hard but fulfilling work and leave a better world to our children and grandchildren. Or said another way, as Thomas Paine said, if there must be trouble, let it be in my day. That my child may have peace. And there is trouble in our day, even today. This month has been a sobering reminder of just how much trouble we face. But first, let me share some of the good news before I share some of the hard. The U.S. Constitution was not written in a vacuum. It was reflective of the heart of the people of its day, their spirit, their culture, their zeitgeist. That movement set in motion innovation, improvement, advancements across the entire spectrum of human endeavor, facilitated in large part by the freedoms guaranteed in the Constitution and the global shift from authoritarian governments to constitutional republics. Since that period, the world has experienced a seismic shift for the better, the vastly better. Consider, for example, the global child mortality rate shown behind me here. If you were born in the time of the founding, or during the time of the founding, roughly 1/3 of all children died in childbirth or soon thereafter, didn't live to the age of 5. Now, consider your children. Consider your siblings. Consider 1/3 of them not here with you. Think of Joseph and Emma Smith. They had 9 biological children. Does anyone know how many of those children passed away in childbirth or early childhood? Anyone? 6. It was 6. 6 of 9 biological children. What was that even like? What was it like for our forebears where normal included the loss of 1/3 or more of your children at childbirth? We do not swim in that water. We do not breathe that air. That is not part of our culture because of the gifts that they gave us. This slide is maternal mortality rate, and this slide only shows from 1990, so last 35 years. It's dropped like 60% just in the last 35 years. Back in the time of the founding, maternal mortality rate was 10 times higher than what it is today. We do not swim in that water. We do not breathe that air. We do not feel the weight of pregnancy and delivery like they did back then. Can you imagine for a moment, put yourself in their shoes? What was that like to bring a family forth into the world with those kinds of pressures, with those kinds of expectations, with those kinds of worries and concerns? We live on the other side of that. How miraculous and wonderful is that? This graph shows global poverty. In red, it shows that back in the time of the founding, 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. 90%. Today, less than 10% live in extreme poverty. That is an incredible miracle. What a blessing. We swim in entirely different water. The air we breathe is entirely different. Our world is so different, and it was brought about by these blessings of freedom, of form, that were gifted to us. A couple more. This one is life expectancy. Now, it's, of course, impacted by child mortality. But back in the days of the founding, you were looking at 30, 35. Who here is under the age of 35? Raise your hand. Everyone else, guess what? Guess what? How many of us would have been able to see our grandchildren, our children go to adulthood, our grandchildren? Now again, it was impacted by infant mortality, but what a different world we live in. It's not even part of our, it's a tragedy if a loved one passes in their 70s or even their 80s, 30s. Such a different world we live in. This is GDP. This is gross domestic product per capita. During the time of the founding, you can see across the globe they were all very much the same. But in the developing nations where these kinds of freedoms, these kinds of governmental structures were in place, we see exponential increase in prosperity. And if you look at that graph, those parts of our country that have not adopted, part of our world, that have not adopted these ideas, still stay in that same bar. They're almost entirely flat. We are so blessed in our day. So that's the good news. This one is literacy rate. Look how literacy within developed nations is near 100%. What an incredible blessing. How often do we run into someone that doesn't know how to read? It's very rare. The blessings of literacy, of education, of knowledge are incredible. Now that's just some of the good news. The truth is we are surrounded by good news. The peace, prosperity, opportunity, information, leisure, health, conveniences that we enjoy would have been unimaginable to the greatest of kings just a few lifetimes ago. Air conditioning, refrigeration, heating, indoor plumbing, travel, flight, computers, artificial intelligence. So why isn't progress inevitable? What stands in its way? Two things: bad ideas and bad behavior. Bad ideas. As Stephen Covey said, we have to make sure our ladder is leaning up against the right wall. How fast we're going doesn't matter if we're traveling in the wrong direction. We have to be heading in the right direction. The ideas behind the Constitution and the freedom and prosperity we enjoy took centuries, even millennia, to develop and hone through painstaking trial and error measured in lifetimes. Bad behavior, well, we all know about that, don't we? No one is immune from bad behavior. The pictures you see here are of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a young man in Russia during Stalin's reign, 20th century. Just passed away, I think, in 2008. You can see that young man that he was. That could be any one of our teachers, right? Any one of our deacons, that young man. When he was in his 20s, he made the fatal mistake of writing to a friend a private letter in which he criticized Stalin. He was thrown into the Gulag, the concentration camps in Soviet Russia. And he wrote, which I cannot read because it's so little, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. So it's not a matter of finding who the good people are and finding who the bad people are and just separating them. That's not the problem we face. We face bad ideas and bad behaviors, and the seeds of both good and bad exist within each of us, every human born, right? The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. What do we do? The ingredients for human freedom and flourishing. What are some of the governmental forms, structures that undergird or are embodied in the U.S. Constitution? This is quiz time. Ideas. Thinking back to your 12th grade civics class, what are some of the forms that we learn about that undergird or encompass or are part of the Constitution? Any volunteers want to remember, like, oh my gosh, 12th grade, that was forever. That wasn't a raised hand, was it? Any ideas? What are some? Yes.
Separation of powers.
Separation of powers, horizontal and vertical. Good. Anyone else?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech. Thank you. Good. Others? Checks and balances. Excellent. Good. Anyone else? Freedom of religion. Freedom of conscience. Good. Federalism. Good. Yes. Any others? Maybe we want to venture guess. Right to bear arms. Right to self-defense, right? So this list up here is just 12 of the major forms or structures, parts, it might be very tiny, that are part of the Constitution. These are some of the things that we learn in our civics class. If you were to expand them, these are some notes that I once took. You can see the Federalist Papers, which Federalist paper talks about each one. The Federalist Papers, President Benson told us to go read those as saints. We could talk about each one of these. We could spend hours diving into the structures. Remember, the Articles of Confederation weren't enough, so they went and they created a new constitution. We could dive into each one of these and talk about how good are these holding up? Are they holding up? Are there any threats to them? Is there any problems? Are they being weakened? Are there any issues there? And we could spend we could do that, and that would be really enjoyable and really fruitful. However, you perhaps have heard this before, maybe not said this way. The condition upon which, this is very tiny, I'm going to see if I can expand it a little bit. The condition upon which God hath given liberty to man is eternal vigilance, which condition, if he break, servitude is at once the consequence of his crime and the punishment of his guilt. That was John Philpott Curran in 1790. You probably know this quote by an abolitionist who came 60 years later who said, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. What are we being eternally vigilant about? How can you be vigilant if you don't know what you're watching out for? So that's my next question, is do we know what we're watching out for? The thing we lose when we quote Phillips instead of Quran is that if we aren't eternally vigilant, servitude is at once the consequence of our crime and the punishment of our guilt. How will we recognize servitude? If we're the frog boiling in the pot, how will we recognize servitude when it comes? Now, here's the crazy thing about everything you just said about the Constitution, that we can spend hours and hours, and people do, and there's whole degrees that you can study, all of that. The founding generation considered the Constitution and its forms, brilliant as though they were, as auxiliary precautions to freedom. Not principle, but auxiliary. What does auxiliary mean? Anybody want to volunteer a venture? What does that word mean, auxiliary? Supportive. Not principle, not primary, but supportive. They saw the Constitution as supportive of other primary principal factors in our freedoms. Why is that? And what was the primary forms? This is James Madison from Federalist 51. What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? Which is, by the way, why so many governments have gotten it wrong, because it wasn't a good match for human nature. It was off in some way. That's where governments go wrong. They're not a good match for human nature. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. And so you have a book that thick called the Federalist Papers that defends all of the reasons behind the Constitution. And you have the Anti-Federalist Papers and so many other sources that are just defending the auxiliary precautions, not even talking about the other principal supports. What were they trying to solve for? Why did they need to form a different form of government? Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 9 articulates the frustration and worry and concern and struggle that the founding generation was having as they looked over 2,000 years of history, trying to understand, is it possible for a people to govern themselves? Because when they looked at the ancient Greek republics, for example, what they saw, they observed with sensations of horror and disgust the distractions with which they were continually agitated, meaning those ancient efforts, attempts at popular government. They noted that they were in a state of perpetual vibration, rocked by furious storms, tempestuous waves of sedition and party rage, wretched nurseries of unceasing discord. Now, this has been a very tumultuous month in our own country. Have any of you felt that there are some wretched nurseries of unceasing discord and some tempestuous waves rocking our people? Why might that be? So, auxiliary precautions are actually number 4 in 4 ingredients for human happiness, freedom, and flourishing. There is number 4. Number 4 is there, the Constitution, only to help when number 1 through 3 fail. Number 4 is to buy you time to get 1 through 3 back up and running. So what are 1 through 3? The founding generation said that the primary principal supports of freedom are widespread education, private virtue, and public virtue. Let's talk about these for a little bit. Widespread education is not what most people think it is. We are a highly trained society. We do a great job of training for the professions. We are not so well educated in the way that they mean. What did they mean? What they meant by highly widespread education was an education in classical liberalism. Now, some people get a little wary about the word liberalism, but it means something very different now than it did back then. Much like other words that have changed, like justice, equality, man, woman. There are words that are changing and have changed. Classic liberalism, liberal arts are the arts of freedom. That's literally what liberal arts mean. It's the arts of the free man. Distinguished from fine arts, mechanical arts, manual arts. These are the arts of freedom. All of us as citizens who can vote need to be versed in the arts of freedom, or otherwise we can't be vigilant. We won't know what to look out for. So, what did a liberal arts education or classic liberalism entail? What kind of an education are we supposed to have? So on the left-hand side, you see 8 topics that basically comprised, we need all Americans to understand these ideas. And where do we get them from? They get them from the other 2 lists of books. The most quoted book during the founding era in political and religious sermons was the Bible. Specifically the book of Deuteronomy, because it is the law. Now we read scriptures in our church. We read the Bible. We read it typically, though, from a perspective of individual, familial improvement. How many of us, this is rhetorical, I don't need to raise your hand, how many of us have studied these books listed there from a political, societal perspective? They did, and they extracted crucial principles of government out of them. They also went to the Greeks and the Romans and extracted from them crucial principles. They, along with other Enlightenment thinkers, worked through those principles and came up with forms of government that now seem obvious to us, like the separation of powers and checks and balances and so forth. But they came through a study of these authors in these books. So, ask for yourself, ask for your family, ask for your community, and for our country at large, how widespread is this kind of an education? This is what makes you vigilant. This is what allows you to be vigilant if you are studying these ideas so you can see when we're going astray from them. We're going to talk about just a few because we have just a short time this evening. Individualism and human rights. We are blessed because almost all Americans believe in the idea of human rights. In fact, the world believes in the idea of human rights, but we don't necessarily know where they come from. And without that understanding, we can have a difficult time defending them. So where do they come from? According to John Locke, one of those individuals on that list, our inalienable rights are inalienable, meaning they can't be taken away because they weren't granted by men. They were granted by God, which is why they can't be taken away. Now, those are called negative rights, by the way. Inalienable rights are negative rights. They can't be taken away. Positive rights, like driver's license, things like that, those are positive rights. Humans can take and give and take those. But negative or inalienable rights are given by God and cannot be taken from us unless we do something like invade someone else's life, liberty, and property. So because we are made in the image of God, we are his. We belong to him. He decides when we come and when we leave. You can't infringe on someone else's life, liberty, and property because you're infringing upon God's sovereignty, God's domain, we don't have that right or authority. So that's where sovereignty comes from. That's where individual sovereignty or legitimate authority, which is one of those 12 that were up there a minute ago, it comes from that idea that we are individual sovereigns because we are made in the image of God. God speaks to us through reason or the light of Christ or our conscience. That's why you can have a whole group of people who've never met each other who can have a common idea of what's right and what's wrong. Now, reason comes from Aristotle, from a book he wrote called Ethics. And he said that every human being has a voice within them that's divine that tells them the right way to act. It's called reason. And in our courts of law, we say, what would a reasonable person do? What would a person do who's listening to the divine voice within them? Someone who's acting unreasonably is acting in contradiction to the divine voice or the light of Christ within them. And that comes from the Greeks. And so you don't have to, your friends and your neighbors don't have to be Christian to have these conversations because they didn't just come from our Judeo-Christian background. They came from Greek and Roman philosophy as well. Agency. God wants us to act in a certain way. He needs that. He wants us to choose. He gives us agency. He gives us duties. We're accountable to him. All of that so what that means is, under classic liberalism, it is a fundamentally humble ideology. At its core, it says, there's a God, and we are not him. Therefore, we cannot force one another to do what we want. There's a God, and we are not him. And if you're atheistic or agnostic, you would say, I don't know if there's a God, but I know I'm not him. Therefore, I can't force my neighbor. And so the only thing that force can be used for is in defense of life, liberty, and property. Everything else must be done through persuasion. That is a core, that's where we get limited government from. It is Locke's idea that the only reason you can use force on a neighbor is if they're using force against you in violation of your life, liberty, and property. Every other good thing that you want to accomplish in life, of which there are many, you must collaborate, you must associate, you must convince. We have gone very far astray from that principle. So widespread education, we just talked about that. Private virtue, public virtue. I'm going to go quick through these because we're short on time and those are a little more easy to understand. Widespread education is in trouble. Most Americans don't have it if that's the definition we're going to go by, which was their definition. Private virtue, we're actually doing, I think, pretty good. Most people want to do good. I'm not going to dive into private virtue because it's exactly what you think it is. It's, according to Aristotle, it's acting in the right way at the right time to the right person to the right length for the right reason. It's be ye therefore perfect, is how we Christians would put it. The Greeks, Aristotle said, it's acting in the right way at the right time for the right reason, which is extremely difficult. It's very, very hard to do that. And you get off just a little bit, and you can, over a long distance, you get way off track. And if someone's off just a little bit, it's really hard to detect. That's why you have to have the widespread education, so you can tell when it's off by just a little bit. That's the greater threat, is when it's off by just a little bit. When it's way off, most of us will notice it and say, I don't want a part of that. But if something is just a little bit off, it's harder to detect unless you have that freedom for education. All right, so to sum up, private and public virtue, which in addition to widespread education, is what the founder said were the three primary pillars of freedom and flourishing, after which the Constitution was simply then there to help us get back on track if we start losing those three. Separation of church and state could be defined in this way. State, or force, only handles defense of life, liberty, and property. Everything else must be handled by we the people associating freely to do the good things that society needs. Well, how do we do that? Well, first of all, we have private virtue, which is becoming men and women of virtue, wisdom, judgment, and property. Wisdom, according to Aristotle, is a knowledge of things that don't change. Judgment is a knowledge of things that do change. So you need to have both. And then virtue is acting in the right way, right reason, right person, right life, all of that. Over your life, you're gaining virtue, wisdom, character, judgment. You're gaining property to support yourself, to be independent, and then to give back generously to your community. When enough people are living that private virtue life at the top, they are then able to freely associate to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless, heal the sick, educate the ignorant, liberate the captive, and create beauty. We, the people, do all of those things, and that's when it becomes public virtue. We go outside of our individual sphere, and then we do all of that. We create the orphanages, we create the hospitals, we create and staff the food banks, whatever it is that our society needs. We, because we're wise, we are men and women of judgment and virtue and property, we have the means and the insight to see what our community needs. Do you see what kind of a society that creates? That's the society they were articulating and arguing for. By the way, when you do that through persuasion, cooperation, consent, compassion, and competition, you are happy. There's meaning, purpose, connection, impact, innovation, and independence in your life. All of those charts that were going in the right direction happened because of this, because of voluntary collaboration, cooperation, competition, etc. And we are about out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead to my last part here. The condition upon which God hath given liberty to man is eternal vigilance, which condition, if he breaks servitude, is at once the consequence of his crime and the punishment of his guilt. So what do? We read, we listen, we discuss, we make a study group. I don't know what it is that you want to do, but we've got to get the widespread education. We've got to work on our private virtue and plan for a life of public virtue. One could argue that in our day and age, what we are taught to do is to have a fruitful profession, raise a family, and then retire. Under this model, retirement consists of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, housing the homeless, educating the ignorant, much like what the church does when we send people on missions. I've spoken with half dozen retired people in the last 6 weeks who all expressed a sense of meaninglessness unless they were on a church mission, because there they felt needed. There they felt this meaning in their life. Imagine if we had that same ethic across all of society. So what can we do? We can read, listen, and discuss, and then engage. How do we engage? This is the last thing that I'd like to share with you. One of the problems that we have in our society is we often frame things in a progressive versus conservative framing. And by progressive and conservative, I don't mean political parties, I mean mindset and personality. Most humans are born with either a conservative outlook of life or a progressive outlook of life, which only means if you're conservative, you naturally see those things that should stay the same. And if you're progressive, you naturally see the things that should be changed. And guess what? There are things that need to stay the same, and there are things that need to change. That's not the problem, but that's how we frame it. And so that creates this division among us. The right framing is persuasion versus power. We should be open to things that need to change, open to things that need to stay the same, but we accomplish them through persuasion, not power. So what does that look like? And this will be my last slide. When we are working together through persuasion, we are seeking truth, because again, humility is the primary mindset of a classic liberal society. There is a God, and I'm not it. I don't know everything. My neighbor probably knows something that I don't. And so it's a humble search for truth. Truth in healthcare, truth in marriages, in parenting, in whatever in field of endeavor, we are seeking for truth. Whereas under power, you're seeking to manipulate and maneuver. The zeitgeist, or the spirit, under persuasion, is one of social and cooperative. Under the other, it's adversarial, because you're trying to get power to force your neighbor to do something that you want, or you. That's largely what's happening right now in our society. That's why you feel the adversarial thing going on, is because we're trying to do things through power rather than persuasion. I'm out of time, so I won't read the rest. Just to point out that, okay, thank you very much, President. Note what happens, the psychology of our citizens. When you're working under persuasion, there's connection, there's interdependence, there's meaning, purpose, impact. When you are working under power framing, there's isolation, aimlessness. Problems are solved by someone else. My job is to relieve my tax burden, not my brother's burden, under a power framing. So we are isolated. We envy. We feel resentment. We can feel some apathy too, not out of laziness, but out of overwhelm, because now, instead of having to just vote about things that are about life, liberty, and property, we have to vote about everything. We have to know about everything. That creates an overwhelm, and it's adversarial. So it's overwhelming, it's adversarial, and lots of people check out. That's a predictable symptom of the pursuit of good ends through power rather than persuasion. There's a lot more we could talk about there. But in closing, we the people established and ordained the Constitution. We also established and ordained a lot of other institutions like families, like churches, like academia, like businesses, like media, like the arts, like communities. And we are to use those institutions to do the good that society needs through persuasion so that others can use their agency and feel that interdependence, that meaning and connection that brings so much fulfillment to our lives. Brothers and sisters, I am so grateful to be the beneficiary of an incredible legacy of generations of men and women who figured this out, did it, and bestowed it to us. But it doesn't persist. It's not self-perpetuating. It has to be learned and granted from one generation to every other. That is our job, that we may do so and pass these blessings of liberty on to our posterity is my prayer. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.